All right, welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. I hope you all are doing okay. Welcome to Chapter 2, covering Reconstruction. Now, obviously, our country is a little bit broken as we have just fought through the Civil War, and now, how is it that we bring our country back together? How do we heal as a country? How do we move forward after an event such as the Civil War? So, in section 1 today, we're going to talk about the plan to do just that. How is it that we bring about the nation's reconstruction? So, as we left off, April 9th, 1865, we'll see the end of the Civil War with a surrender at Appomattox by General Robert E. Lee to the Union military. So now it is up to Abraham Lincoln, weirdly enough pictured here, in order to try and bring about the fix to the country. Now, in trying to address the problems of the Civil War, obviously there is a lot that needs to be fixed, not to mention new problems, not necessarily problems, but new things that have to be dealt with as a result of the ending of the war. So Lincoln is once again trying to heal the country, once again his idea of bringing everything back together, even though he may not necessarily do it in the best way possible. And it may seem a bit impossible to do just that. Looking at the political cartoon here, even though that is a very terrible depiction of Abraham Lincoln, we see here he is trying to mend the country back together, that the large crack between the North and the South, that he is merely going to fix it together with Union glue. Even though the artist is trying to depict here how Lincoln is attempting to bring the country back together, but glue just simply may not be enough. But that is not going to stop Lincoln from trying. Now, one of the very first programs that Lincoln will attempt is the Freedmen's Bureau, which, as its name implies, has to deal with the newly freed men of the South, with slavery now essentially gone thanks to the Emancipation Proclamation, now that it is actually coming into effect into the Southern territories. Well, we have to help those former slaves adjust to their life. They have to learn how to function in society, how to walk in society, how to engage in commerce, how to read, and the Freedmen's Bureau is going to help with all of these things. Now, again, Lincoln is more interested in healing, in bringing everyone back together, and this is illustrated by his 10% plan. Now, Lincoln would allow for the states to come back in, the former Confederate states rather, that they could come back in, have their representation in Congress once more, that people could exercise their rights, once 10% of a state's population swore their loyalty to the United States, as well as the state accepted the Emancipation Proclamation. Now, the problem with this is that realistically 10% is a very small number. Getting just 10% to represent the whole and represent that everything is going to kind of be as it was before the war is a bit of a stretch and incredibly optimistic, if not outright delusional to an extent. Now, the problem for Lincoln is going to be is that his fellow Republicans aren't going to necessarily all agree. Remember, Lincoln talked about prior to the election of 1860 that he would be more than willing to let the South keep slavery if it meant keeping the country together. But now that the war has been ended and that slavery has been ended, he's still of the mindset of let's just get things back together. Whereas his radical Republican companions, those who wanted to end slavery right then and there in 1860, they're going to push for a lot stronger effort. They're going to push for that an actual majority, 50% plus one, actually surrender, or rather swear their loyalty back to the United States. Now, unfortunately for Lincoln, he's not going to get the chance to achieve his plan. Now, on April 14th, 1865, just 5 days after the end of the Civil War, Lincoln is going to wake up for the final time. Now, that morning on April 14th, 1865, Lincoln will, ironically enough, sign into law the creation of the Secret Service. It is ironic because today we know the Secret Service as being the agency charged with protecting the president. But what is rather interesting is that in these days, it did not protect the president. The original point and purpose behind the Secret Service was to investigate and deal with the scourge of counterfeit money. Now, during the time of the Civil War, 1 out of every 3 pieces of currency was counterfeit. So, just like your shoes in the classroom, 1 out of 3 of them are a fake. Now, later on that day, Lincoln will decide to attend a play at Ford's Theater, where, as we know, he will be assassinated by John Wilkes Booth. So, the purpose behind Booth assassinating Lincoln was that he was part of a greater conspiracy that was going to attempt to assassinate multiple government leaders on that night. However, Booth will be the only one who makes an attempt, let alone is actually successful in doing so. So, John Wilkes Booth will shout, "Sic semper tyrannis," death to the tyrant, shooting Lincoln dead. Actually, Lincoln will die the next morning, whereas John Wilkes Booth will be killed upon his capture. So, while Booth shot Lincoln in an attempt to revive the Confederacy and start the Civil War once more, that will not be the case, and the Confederacy will still stay a footnote in the dustbin of history. Now, when a president dies, that means their vice president takes over. Now, in the election of 1864, President Lincoln would choose a new vice presidential running mate, a man by the name of Andrew Johnson. He was a former senator from Tennessee. He was also a Democrat. So he is a Southerner, not to mention a former Democrat. Now, the reason why Lincoln, a Republican, picks a Democrat to be his running mate is that he wants to show that he can work with the other side. He can go about, work with them, and want to show his willingness to work with the South. But with Lincoln now dead, Johnson's going to be the one in charge of leading Reconstruction. And much like Lincoln had proposed going easy on South, just welcoming them back in, Johnson, of course, is then going to do the same given his background as a Southerner. Now, the thing is, due to his Southern roots, Johnson is going to push for more softening conditions than even Lincoln had. So Johnson's going to ask for amnesty for former Confederates. Basically, amnesty is defined as forgiveness. So he wanted to forgive all of the Confederates, minus the ones that were at the very top levels or were the military leaders. So, for example, sworn officers like Generals Robert E. Lee, and so forth. But obviously, the radical Republicans, the same ones that challenged even Lincoln in his policy, obviously are going to come out against Johnson and push for a stronger result from the South, or stronger concessions, rather. Now, in order to fix the South is going to be broken up into 5 military-run districts. So 5 different generals will help to manage the southern states until they come to terms and are once again full-fledged members of the United States. These actions being known as the Reconstruction Acts. Now, also as part of that, you would have people come in from the North to come and aid in Reconstruction, whether it was helping out the military-run districts, administering government, or they were taking part as members of the Freedmen's Bureau. These people would come down from the North to the South in order to aid in these efforts. Now, these individuals were nicknamed carpetbaggers. The reason why they were given that name is because their luggage that they traveled with was a bag made out of carpet-like material. Again, America is not that great at naming things. Now, the thing is, Southerners deeply, deeply hated and resented the carpetbaggers. They saw them as vultures preying off their misery, that they were just there to inflict their way of life, to ruin them, to rub the victory in their faces, make money off their misery, and worse yet to them, actually help African Americans succeed in society by showing them how to get elected into government and take part in society. So the South really did not like these carpetbaggers, these people coming in from the North. Now, there would be some Southerners who did like them because these Northerners also helped to kind of rebuild and, just improve the society as a whole. However, these Southerners disliked the Southerners that were liking the carpetbaggers, and they would give them the nickname scalawags, which is where that term comes from. Now, I'm looking at the next picture here. Not to worry too much, but this gives you an idea of the various districts and when they eventually readmitted into the Union. All right. Now, most importantly here, what we are going to discuss are the Reconstruction Amendments. These were the 3 amendments that the Southern states had to accept in order to have their full rights restored and representation as a state given back to them. So the Reconstruction Amendments, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, all of these deal with the issues of the war, that being primarily slavery, and now what do we do as a nation with these newly freed people? So first and foremost, the 13th Amendment banned slavery. Now there is only one exception. There is only one way to legalize slavery in the United States, and that is prison. Prison is the only allowed form of slavery in the United States as allowed here by the 13th Amendment. Now perhaps most importantly here is the 14th Amendment. So, the 14th Amendment creates 2 things. The first of which is what's known as birthright citizenship. So anyone that is born within the United States, anyone that is born in the territory, regardless of the parent citizenship status, anything about them, no matter what, if you are born in the United States, you are thereby a citizen. So even if, say, someone came here on vacation, they went into labor early and that baby was born, doesn't matter what country they're from, that baby is an American. Now, why was this done? This was done to make all former slaves now citizens of the United States. As the importation of slaves had been banned in 1808, the great majority of slaves were born in the United States, and due to the 14th Amendment and the concept of birthright citizenship, they are now citizens, which means now that they are citizens, they now have rights. So the case of Dred Scott, where we saw the African Americans were dismissed of having rights, well, now they are citizens and now they have those rights. But in going a step further, the 14th Amendment also adds in what we will call the Equal Protection Clause, stating that all citizens have equal protection under the law. What this means is that no group can have rights or abilities that other groups are then denied. So what will first be used as a measure for race in discussing how African Americans cannot be denied rights that that white Americans enjoy. This will later then be extended to other groups. So, for example, in dealing with sex and gender, not to mention other types of classifications. Now, of your rights, one of the most important is your right to vote, and that will be guaranteed by the 15th Amendment. Now, in this statement, the 15th Amendment allows, or rather clarifies, that the right to vote cannot be taken away due to your race or your condition of previous servitude, aka slavery. Now, the thing is, in making this, essentially what they've done is say you can't take away your right to vote due to these 2 clauses. What the South will do, as we'll talk about in part 2 of Reconstruction, is how they move around that. Now, as a kind of like a quick story here to kind of drive this point home. Unfortunately, I had to ground my son the other day. He was messing around at dinner, and we told him, go to bed. Going to bed usually implies that you have to go to sleep. So, in this case here, as we see, the 15th Amendment says you cannot take away your right to vote due to race. So, getting back to the story about my son, after cleaning up the table, doing the dishes, I go and check on him in his room. and I notice the lights are on. Clearly, I told him to go to bed, so why are the lights on if he should be asleep? Sure enough, I walk in, and he is in bed playing his Nintendo Switch. When I ask him, what are you doing? He just said, you told me to go to bed. You didn't say anything about me being able to play my Nintendo Switch. So my son, who is going to turn 12 soon, found his loophole around it. And just as the 15th Amendment here is designed to guarantee the rights of black men in being able to vote, that does not mean that the South isn't going to find ways to strip them of their right to vote, which we'll discuss in Section 2. Now, lastly here, President Johnson and the Radical Republicans. Now, many of the Radical Republicans feel that Johnson and his use of the veto is standing in their way of creating, the country that they want, that they are an obstacle, that Johnson is an obstacle, and he's just merely standing in the way of progress. Now, following the election of 1866, the Radical Republicans now compose a supermajority in Congress, which means they can overturn any of his vetoes. But yet, President Johnson is still issuing vetoes, which means the process of passing laws is going to be made that much longer rather than difficult. So ultimately, the Radical Republicans get in their mind that it is time to remove Johnson from the equation. Now, they're not going to get rid of Johnson in the same way that John Wilkes Booth got rid of Lincoln. Instead, they're going to follow the constitutional process known as impeachment. Now, in impeachment, it says that you can remove a federal officer for quote-unquote high crimes or misdemeanors. And in this case, the great violation was that President Andrew Johnson had violated the Tenure of Office Act, a relatively minor thing. But to the Radical Republicans who wanted him gone, it was just enough to start the process of impeachment. So, Johnson will be voted on by the House. They will recommend articles of impeachment, which will then move the trial to whether or not to remove him from office to the Senate. There, Andrew Johnson is able to strike a deal with one of the Republican congressmen. He's able to avoid impeachment just by one vote, but ultimately the rest of his presidency is neutered, and that will be it for President Johnson. He will finish out the rest of his term. He's not going to stand in the way of the radical Republican agenda, and instead will fade away to obscurity with the election of 1868 and an old former Civil War hero coming to the aid of the country. So, that brings us to an end for Section 1. Thank you guys for joining me today, so hopefully this helps you all out. Stay tuned, as next we'll be going over Section 2, why Reconstruction, unfortunately, was a failure. Thank you guys. Have a great day. Take care.